Okay, I think we'll get started. It's about 7:01. Again, I'd like to welcome everyone to tonight's webinar, Peer and Practice Assessment, and to thank you for taking time out of your schedules to join us. My name is Lara Thacker. I'm the Director of Quality Assurance here at the college, and with me is Ryan Pastana, our Communications and Policy Analyst, and he's going to provide us with some technical support this evening. I'm going to speak with you for about an hour tonight about a new QA program component that's being implemented and which is going to have tremendous importance for you. It's the Peer and Practice Assessment. So I'll begin by explaining why we have a quality assurance program and where the Peer and Practice Assessment fits in with relation to the other program components. And then I'm going to touch on the essential competencies of practice for kinesiologists in Ontario and why they were developed and how they're relevant to your practice and to the Peer and Practice Assessment. I'll describe the format of Peer and Practice Assessment and how the tools are designed really to promote continuing competence. I'll share with you how you can prepare for your, should you be selected this May. And finally, I'll speak about how this program component is going to improve the practice of the profession. And I'd like to reserve the last 15 minutes of the session for your questions and maybe some discussion. And so you can type and send us your questions throughout the webinar. And in case you missed a portion of tonight's webinar, do note that it will be posted on our website. So why do we have a quality assurance program? Well, under the Regulated Health Professions Act, all regulated health professions have a legislated obligation to assess continuing competence. And so every college is required to have a QA program, which includes continuing education or professional development designed to promote continuing competence and quality improvement among members. They're also required to have self-assessment, which is really the first step in the QA program cycle. And self-assessment is intended to help you reflect on areas for improvement as well as plan activities to reach your individual learning goals. And then we're, of course, supposed to have peer and practice assessment. And PPA is a process where trained assessors work with members to demonstrate that they are meeting the practice standards and essential competencies of practice for the profession. And then finally, all colleges are required to have mechanisms in place to monitor their members' participation in these program requirements. So indeed, we are mandated to have a QA program, and we're not picking on KINs here. The legislation is fairly prescriptive about the required content. So I'm going to speak briefly now about the essential competencies, which were released last fall and which inform the development of the Peer and Practice Assessment component. The essential competencies of practice are essentially the big umbrella, the overarching set of validated behaviors required to provide safe, ethical, and competent services at any level of practice. We knew that the competencies are demonstrated at entry level differently than by experienced practitioners. So we identified really a need to expand the original kinesiologist core competency profile in order to describe the knowledge, skill, and judgment required throughout a member's career. There was also a need to develop additional competencies to reflect the many areas of your practice, including roles in management and administration, education, and research. And we call this non-clinical practice. So by non-clinical, we mean practitioners who are not involved in direct client care and who do not keep patient records. Now, what we heard from other colleges was that a lot of their non-clinical members left the professions until colleges started recognizing those non-clinical competencies. So we wanted to keep our leaders in the profession and retain that intellectual wealth, so we added non-clinical competencies. And we're now at a point where we're ready to implement the second phase of the quality assurance program, Peer and Practice Assessment. So we needed to have measurable indicators to assess your continuing competence. And of course, we're required by legislation to publish our standards for public accountability because it's important that the public, as well as members, can read and understand the college's minimum expectations. They help other professions also understand your roles and expertise as professionals. And of course, the college uses them as a foundation upon which to develop practice standards, QA program components such as self-assessment and peer and practice assessment. So we expanded the previous domain titles to the 5 units listed here. You'll notice that we now refer to units instead of domains to be consistent with language used by other healthcare professions. For Unit 1, effective practice of kinesiology requires all of you to have mastered foundational knowledge. Job tasks within the scope of practice for kinesiologists, and frankly many of the tasks within other regulated health professions such as physiotherapy, occupational therapy, dietitians, etc., lie within the public domain. That means that anyone can do them. So what distinguishes the professional from the layperson is that foundational knowledge. And even if you think you don't use some of the things that you learned in school, it's the foundational knowledge that enables you to make sound judgments and deliver effective programs and provide feedback and support to other healthcare practitioners. And foundational knowledge is continually changing and growing with new research findings, and they impact your practice. So the competencies and performance indicators in this unit would describe how you would apply that knowledge in your practice. Now for Unit 2, professional practice, this was revised to include education, counseling, program development, and evaluation. So the unit now reflects the profession as it is practiced more broadly. It contains references to prevention and wellness and language that's really distinctive to your profession. Unit 3 now includes business management and leadership skills. They don't describe particular skills such as accounting, contract development, or even facilities management, but they have been added to allow those of you in private practice to understand the competencies in the broader sense of managing a business and employing and supervising others. So we're not going to tell you how to bill your clients or how much to charge, but your fees have to be reasonable, transparent, and consistent. In Unit 4, communication and collaboration, we have added advocacy because the public expects that you will advocate for their interests. And advocacy includes advocating with the client as well as contributing to the understanding by other professionals of the value of kinesiology services. And advocacy works hand in glove with collaboration and communication. It's really all about helping the client. Also, we've learned from other colleges that communication is a common area where members fall short and can wind up with public complaints. So it's really important that a new practitioner understands the importance of these skills. And this is the new Essential Competencies Framework. So at the top we have units, and this is a set of competencies with an overarching statement. Then we have competencies, and these define the knowledge, skill, and judgment across all practice areas. Performance indicators are action statements, which describe how the competency is measured and observed. And then finally, we have practice illustrations, and these are just detailed examples of performance indicators. So the performance indicators and practice illustrations are really intended to ground abstractions and provide further detail around what day-to-day practice looks like. For example, for assessment and treatment, we would want to know that you are drawing on theories and models or your rationale for selecting a particular intervention. And the relevance of particular competencies and performance indicators will depend on your individual practice setting, roles, and responsibilities. So it may not be possible or necessary to apply certain performance indicators in a particular practice setting, and the practice illustrations are not exhaustive lists, but really intended to be examples of everyday practice, so you're not expected to meet all of them. And we, of course, will be adding and updating the performance indicators and practice illustrations periodically based on your feedback as well as developments within the profession. So we've now been through phase 1 of the quality assurance program, self-assessment, and we've just completed our second cycle. So you should be getting a sense of where your strengths are and where there is room for improvement. And the college has identified some areas where we could provide you with further support. So for example, we use the aggregate data from last year's self-assessment to develop webinars on record keeping, professional boundaries, and consent, as well as enhance some of our practice standards and guidelines. But we know that self-assessment has its limits, and current research shows that self-assessment is not accurate, and that even when we find gaps, sometimes we only tackle the ones we're most interested in or most comfortable with addressing, which are not necessarily the most important ones. So more important for improvement is that self-directed feedback-seeking behavior. You need objective external feedback to calibrate your self-assessment and learning plan. And we know that this external feedback often leads to instant insights and opportunities for competency enhancement through education and self-remediation. So it's now time to implement phase 2 of the program, which is peer and practice assessment. Each year, up to 1% of the membership will be randomly selected to undergo an assessment. So we'll have 2 random selection periods, one in the spring and one in the fall, and the spring period will begin May 1st. Members will have 3 months to complete the peer and practice assessment. There are other reasons a member could be asked to undergo a peer and practice assessment, for example, if they were short on currency hours, or failed to complete their annual self-assessment or continuing professional development activities. The college could provide other criteria, which they publish on its website, in advance of a random selection. So for example, if we identified a certain practice area where registrants were having trouble, we would conduct a stratified random selection. But for today's purposes, I'm going to really be focusing on the random selection process. So I will note that new graduates will be exempt for 3 years after passing the entry to practice exam. During the peer and practice assessment, a trained peer assessor will ask the member to describe situations that have occurred in their practice, actions and critical thinking, and if they provide direct care to clinical patients or clients, the assessor will also ask the member to engage in a patient record review to talk about record keeping. Practice will be assessed based on the essential competencies of practice, and the assessor's role in this process is merely to collect data and information about the member's practice in order to allow the Quality Assurance Committee to make a decision. So the assessors are really fact gatherers, and so it's quite a unique role. They do not determine the outcomes, but that is rather left to the Quality Assurance Committee. So I want you to take a moment here and think about what images come to mind when you hear the words peer and practice assessment. These words often strike terror into the hearts of members of regulatory bodies. You might be feeling some fear or anxiety or picturing a job interview or a performance review. I tried to think of an image those words might trigger for someone who has yet to go through the process, and here's one I came up with. Buckwheat. It tastes awful and it works. Now some of you may experience some initial discomfort if you receive an email on Friday from the college indicating you've been selected to undergo a peer and practice assessment, and that's completely natural, but I want to ensure you that this process will be highly beneficial for you. It really is designed to strengthen your practice, and although it requires a little bit of motivation and organization and effort, the rewards really are infinite. The process has a lot of value to you as members. It's an educational opportunity designed to help you identify areas of strength and practice improvement. And the external feedback is really intended to give you peace of mind that you are doing things correctly. So something I very recently discovered is that assessment comes from a Latin word which means to sit beside. Assessment is considered a part of the learning process. It's part of an understanding of progress. Sitting beside someone is key to gathering information and recognizing that individual's abilities, their learning process, and how we can help improve their understanding. So peer and practice assessment is an opportunity to sit down with one of your colleagues, a registered kinesiologist from a similar practice area, and speak frankly about your practice, record keeping, assessment, communication, which is different from evaluation. And this cartoon is meant to capture this fine point. Our college's QA program is founded on guiding principles. We start with the premise that all of you are competent, self-directed, and motivated adult learners committed to lifelong learning. This is meant to be a two-way educational process. You need formative feedback from others to calibrate your self-assessment and learning plan. We can all use formative feedback. That's what makes us professionals, and that's how we keep growing. And the college is learning as well. So if we see an area where the profession is having some trouble, we know that we need to do more work there. We use evidence-based tools such as peer and practice assessment, behavior-based interview questions, as well as chart review, and I'm going to be describing these tools in greater detail shortly. As a regulated health professional, you're accountable for your practice, so you're expected to think more critically about what you're doing and why, and not just be operating on autopilot. Your title affords you power and credibility, and therefore you're expected to adhere to standards within your practice. And our peer and practice assessment is intended to be proactive. So we are actively trying to prevent public complaints before they occur. We hear that in some professions in the States, QA programs merely consist of reporting continuing education credits, and regulatory bodies have a less prominent role in their members' practice until a complaint occurs. Well, our peer and practice assessment process is what makes our QA program proactive and supportive. So how is the PPA structured? Well, for those of you in clinical and mixed practice, there will be a 1 to 2 hour patient record review. We know that many of you are in mixed practice, both clinical and non-clinical, and so even if you only see 1 or 2 patients, we would consider that clinical practice. And because we're using patient records and you cannot take these out of your office, we do this part face-to-face at your primary employment site. And so we would ask you to provide 10 records from which the assessor selects 5, and together you would talk about record keeping and check that all of your records include the requisite components, so consent, the treatment plan, financial records. There will, of course, be some parameters around chart selection. So, for example, if you do a controlled act or work with support personnel or recently discharged patients, we would ask for a range of charts with those kind of notations. And the record should reflect a course of treatment and not just a single visit. So the assessor may say, show me where you documented informed consent in the assessment. Now the assessor does not make a judgment at that time. They're just using a structured checklist. And this is a good opportunity for education. And we want to ensure that you're keeping good records, because good record keeping, of course, protects you as a practitioner. Then you would pick one case to use for a series of case-based interview questions, and you would discuss the care that you provided and your decision-making processes around that case. Then there are a series of situation-based interview questions around events that have occurred. We won't provide case study questions because we want you to come up with the critical thinking and your own examples from your practice. To prepare for these questions, you'll need to focus on and recall specific situations or events that have occurred in your practice in which you personally managed or acted. Then for those of you in non-clinical practice, we can do your assessment over the telephone. You don't have patient records, so there's no added value to an on-site assessment. We may ask for your processes and templates related to performance review or program development or evaluation, because we need to show that you are meeting the standards. And questions will be customized to your specific responsibilities and function. We know that we have to tailor our assessments to meet the broad scope of practice of this profession, and so anyone selected to undergo a peer and practice assessment will complete a pre-questionnaire prior to the assessment. And that really helps bring context both to the assessor as well as the Quality Assurance Committee. It focuses the assessment time, and it ensures that there's appropriate match in terms of practice, language, and location. So if your practice is clinical or mixed in nature, as I mentioned, the PPA will occur at your place of work, and you're responsible for booking the location. Typically, the interview is conducted at your primary employment site. So if you're in private practice, the assessment is usually performed in a public facility. For example, a private room located at a community center, or a college meeting room, or a private room in a public library. You'll want to choose a location that's quiet and private. A private residence or public area, such as a coffee shop or cafeteria, are not appropriate. The interview location should have a large table to review your client records, 2 chairs, and access to an electrical outlet for the peer assessor's laptop. And the location must be available for the entire 4-hour interview. Now, for those of you in non-clinical practice, the interview is shorter, 2.5 hours in length, and it will be conducted on the telephone. The location, again, must be quiet and free from distraction, so no disruptions from home or from work. Case-based and situation-based questions come from the behavior-based interview methodology. So many of you have probably been in a job interview when the interviewer asked, describe a situation when. Well, that's a behavior-based interview, or a BBI. They were originally used as a job hiring interview tool to assess on-the-job skills, and research shows that interview questions designed to ask about past job strategies and behaviors are a strong predictor of how people will perform on the job in the future. So regulatories across Canada have used BBI to measure competency because it draws out a member's telling of a past event or incident when a specific skill or behavior was demonstrated, and then uses this information as a performance indicator. So the assessor will ask a series of scripted questions to get a consistent rating against the essential competencies and practice standards. There will be a hierarchy of questions constructed with an orientation statement and a core question that introduces a topic and focuses on a specific essential competency. For example, kinesiologists are required to demonstrate knowledge of and apply the principles of informed consent. Putting on a clinician's hat, describe the steps that you would take to obtain informed consent prior to initiating services. So this would be an example of a situation-based question. Then the assessor will ask a series of probing questions to focus you and engage you in dialogue and gather details to ensure that he or she can score the performance indicator. So for example, what information would you share to ensure that the patient client is fully informed to make a decision? Or how would you identify that the patient client understood the information shared? Identify a situation when obtaining informed consent may be problematic. What steps would you take to rectify the issues? How would you determine who has the authority to provide informed consent? We know that obtaining informed consent involves communicating the purpose, risks, benefits, side effects, consequences of not having treatment, alternatives, and cost of the proposed treatment plan to the patient or client. We also know that it's not good enough to have the patient sign a consent form for a variety of reasons we have touched upon in the college's webinar on consent. You must obtain informed consent before you provide treatment. It's all about the dialogue with the patient, full and frank disclosure of risks, and the meaningful discussion tailored to the client. When treatment is ongoing, consent is not a one-time event. You need to know at a minimum when consent needs to be obtained again. And we want to hear this understanding and application of knowledge in your answers during the peer and practice assessment. We want to know that you know about capacity, that is always presumed, and that there is no age for consent. And you should know about the hierarchy of substitute decision makers. And even if you don't know the order by heart, where you can go to obtain that information promptly. So do watch the college's webinar on consent. That's a big hint. Here's another example of a situation-based question. Kinesiologists are expected to apply principles of financial stewardship and resource management. Describe a situation when you identified the need to improve productivity to optimize resources. And these are the probing questions. Explain your goals in this situation. How did your change impact staff workload? What steps did you take to address staff workload changes? What financial implications did you consider? And how did you maintain ethical financial practices? So here again, we're looking for clues that exemplify productivity and efficiency. Financial stewardship is not just about maintaining a budget. It's about being efficient with time and resources. So booking and managing rooms, purchasing supplies, and scheduling staff time would be considered good examples. Be sure to focus your answers about a specific case or situation, and you'll want to refrain from speaking in generalities. So say, on this occasion, I did such and such. We know we can't assess every competency out there. We simply don't have time. The membership guide to the Peer and Practice Assessment contains the list of core questions that we will be asking you. So we're not trying to hide anything from you. You have a lot of resources available to you to help you prepare. So some of you may be wondering, what if the assessor doesn't score me well because I do things a little differently? Well, we're not looking for the assessor's personal opinions about how well you did or whether you're doing things exactly the same way. We're just looking for whether the competency was there. Did you meet the performance indicator, yes or no? It's about measuring against what's been validated and approved by the college council. So if you meet the minimum criteria, that's going to be acceptable. It doesn't matter about the particular skill, modality, or apparatus you used. It's about assessing whether you followed risk assessment protocol, obtained informed consent, and demonstrated interprofessional collaboration. So what happens if this Friday you receive an email from the college that you've been selected? First, I would strongly encourage you to read the membership guide to the Peer and Practice Assessment right away. Even if you're not selected, it's a good idea to read the guide because all of the case-based and situation-based core questions are listed in the guide, and they'll give you insight into things to tweak in your practice. And then you'll be ready for when you are selected, and you'll be able to share your knowledge with your peers. Also, I would encourage you to read the checklist at the back of the guide. If you're in clinical or mixed practice, be sure to read the patient record review tool as well. As I mentioned earlier, you'll be asked to complete a questionnaire which asks for information about your practice area and schedule. You'll want to book your interview location and time. And if you provide direct patient care, you need to retrieve 10 records of current and/or discharged patients to review with a peer assessor. So you'll want to familiarize yourself with the files prior to the assessment so that you can refer to them during the record review and consult them during the case-based clinical questions. And finally, be sure you are present for the Peer and Practice Assessment at the designated date and time. There are several steps that you can take to prepare. The essential competencies of practice of kinesiologists in Ontario do provide the foundation for the Peer and Practice Assessment. Therefore, I encourage you to review this document. Also, if you haven't already done so, take a look at the webinars on record keeping, consent, and professional boundaries. These are excellent resources and a really quick and convenient way to refresh your knowledge and ensure you're prepared for questions on these topics. And the links to those webinars are, of course, posted on our website. Finally, I would encourage you to call the college. Cara Moroney, the Director of Professional Conduct, and I are both available to answer any of your practice questions. So what do you need to bring to the assessment? Well, you need to bring a hard copy of your 2 most recently completed individual learning plans, and you can actually print these off of the online self-assessment portal, and instructions on how to do this are outlined in the membership guide to the PPA. And as I mentioned, if you're in clinical or mixed practice, you're going to need to retrieve 10 patient-client records. And be sure to include all of the following records in these patient-client records. So the progress notes, the history notes, referral forms, equipment records, financial records, consent records. If your records are electronic, you're going to need to print the records before your interview. So what happens then after the interview? Well, the peer assessor writes a report which we send to you along with a summary of any gaps identified during the assessment. And you'll have about 30 days to send a written submission and offer any additional information that was not communicated during the interview. So you may wish to include a summary of your self-identified strengths or learning needs, evidence of self-remediation, so any changes you've made to your practice since the peer and practice assessment, or new templates that you developed and incorporated into your practice, details of changes in your practice based on feedback, and points of clarification related to the assessment. And then this information goes to the Quality Assurance Committee. And if the committee confirms that your knowledge, skills, and judgment are indeed satisfactory, you would simply receive a notice of completion. If the committee determines that there are knowledge, skills, and judgments that are not satisfactory, you may be provided with an opportunity to make a submission, and then the committee would consider your submission. If it's still of the opinion that the knowledge, skill, and judgment is not satisfactory, they can provide you with advice or recommendations or require you to participate in some form of competency enhancement, such as a course or a reflective paper or a mentorship program. Staff will anonymize the report, so your name does not appear before the Quality Assurance Committee. We redact that information to enable the committee to be impartial and unbiased when they're reviewing the information. In rare cases, a committee may need to impose terms, conditions, and limits on your certificate of registration if there's a possibility of significant harm to your patient. So the peer and practice assessment process is confidential. We do not notify your employer of your selection or report your results to your employer. You're not obligated to tell your employer about your participation in the PPA or share any feedback or results with them. You may, however, have to let your employer know that you're undergoing the process just in order to facilitate the review and retrieval of patient-client records. And only if there are serious concerns around misconduct, incompetence, or incapacity would the QA committee refer a member's name and list of concerns to the Inquiries, Complaints, and Reports Committee. And as I mentioned before, on very rare and serious occasions, the QA committee can impose terms, conditions, and limits on a member's certificate, but that is extremely rare. Information supplied by members in compliance with the Quality Assurance Program cannot be shared with any other committee, including the Discipline Committee or used in court. So essentially what I'm saying is that what happens in QA stays in QA. This is really not supposed to be a scary program or process. You can be candid with your assessor. This is intended to provide an educational forum for you so that you can grow and learn, and it's supposed to be supportive of you. So in terms of access to your patient records, the college does have the right to access patient records and the authority to request access to personal information for the purpose of conducting an assessment. This authority is cited in the code, the Health Professions Procedural Code, and facility operators and health information custodians are required to provide access to premises and charts. So we encourage you to follow your organizational policies regarding access to patient-client records. As I said before, in some cases it might be prudent to inform your employer that you're undergoing this process, and certainly if your employer does raise concerns, you are encouraged to have your employer contact me at the college, and we can work with them to help them understand our purview. So I hope you're all feeling a little bit more comfortable now about peer and practice assessment, and that this experience could be a positive one for you, and that you know what to expect if you're selected for an assessment on Friday. So remember, peer and practice assessment is really meant to protect both the public and you as a healthcare professional. It's meant to improve your practice and really raise the bar for the profession. Even though there will only be a handful of you on Friday who are selected to participate in this process, you will be refining your practice and sharing your experience with other kinesiologists, whether through peer group discussions or your team meetings or at professional association conferences, and you're probably going to be able to share your new knowledge and insights with your colleagues. So the more you improve individually, the more you improve as a profession. And this is going to give the profession more credibility. And as you gain credibility and mature as a profession, the better you're able to advocate for additional responsibility within the healthcare continuum. Also, what other colleges have reported is, from their experience, the biggest risk factor for their membership are practitioners working in private practice. So members who did not have the benefit of working with other regulated healthcare professionals were receiving the critical external feedback to confirm that what they're doing was in fact correct. No one was reviewing their records periodically or discussing their clinical reasoning with them, and these practitioners would often drift into social isolation. So this is why our peer and practice assessment is so important for you. Even though we're only beginning with a handful of you on Friday, the hope is that the value of the process will spread by word of mouth and spark some conversation about good practices, and that there will be a ripple effect, and that some of you will come forward for the next random selection in the fall and seek out opportunities to discuss your practice with your peers. Peer and practice assessment will improve the quality of healthcare services for the public and enhance public confidence in the profession. We know that self-regulation is the best model for ensuring competent, safe, and ethical healthcare. You as members have the foundational knowledge to guide developments in practice and set the standards for the profession and to hold your peers to account. But we also know that self-regulation is a privilege, and that with privilege comes responsibility. Each of you has the ability to raise the bar for the profession. By now you should have a good understanding of the purpose of the peer and practice assessment and how the essential competencies of practice are relevant to your practice in the QA program. I would encourage you again to read through the essential competencies of practice as well as the membership guide to the PPA, discuss the documents with your colleagues, and look for areas to strengthen in your practice. This is an excellent opportunity now to clarify anything you're unsure about with your peers or call the college. And if you haven't already done so, again, look at the webinars that we've posted on our website. I'm now going to open up the webinar and spend the last portion addressing some of your questions, and then we will end promptly at 8 p.m. So if you haven't already done so, this is the time that you can type in your questions and send them to us. Or, of course, if you're feeling more comfortable, you can send me a private email. I'll give you my contact details at the end of the webinar. So let's see if we have any questions. Okay, well, we have one on maternity leave. Now, we do have a policy on requests for deferrals and exemptions, and so we will consider them based on extenuating circumstances. So members who are unable to complete the peer and practice assessment may be granted a deferral for parental leave, injury, or illness. And as I said, we do have policies regarding referrals and deferrals and exemptions. You would be required to notify the college in writing as soon as possible of your request and provide some supporting documentation along with that. Okay, so we have another question here about nature of practice. So for nature of practice, what we mean by clinical practice is members who use their knowledge, skills, and judgment to provide direct client care to patients or clients, and that includes conducting assessments or managing cases, making referrals, performing treatment, providing counseling or advice to an individual or a group. And by non-clinical, we mean using all of the knowledge, skills, and judgment outside of direct client care. So this would include teaching, any members involved in administration, researchers, or program developers. Members in mixed practice are those that have elements of both clinical and non-clinical practice. So even if you only have 1 or 2 clinical patients, we would consider you to be in mixed practice, and so you would be undergoing the clinical peer and practice assessment. So we have another question about what is the time frame between being notified and undergoing the peer and practice assessment. So you who are randomly selected for the first set of PPAs this Friday, May 1st, you'll receive a notice this Friday, and you will have 3 months in which to complete your PPA. So what we would ask is that, if you receive this notice, that you complete the pre-questionnaire within a couple of weeks. So that'll give us an indication about the nature of your practice and the roles and responsibilities within your practice, your location and availability. And then we would work to match you with an appropriate peer assessor. We do have a question about continuing education credits, how many are required, and I should clarify that we do not require a particular number of continuing education credits. We've moved to sort of a more flexible model. So within the self-assessment that was completed by March 1st, all members were required to identify a minimum of 3 learning goals with a minimum of 1 learning activity per goal, and then members would work throughout the year to achieve and realize their learning goals. Okay, we have a question here. Within a group care setting, is charting for each client required? So within a group care setting, this is a good question, we would say that charting is required, and your chart should indicate the healthcare professional who is responsible for the care and for the notation within the patient record. So any sort of assessment that you're completing, working with a patient, that would be considered clinical practice. So you would be participating in the clinical peer and practice assessment, the 4-hour on-site interview, and you would be expected to bring records for at least 10 patients or clients with you to the assessment. Now this is an interesting question, great question. What if you transitioned from mixed to non-clinical practice over the year? How will you be assessed? I think that we would include you in the mixed practice, and so we would still want to see, you know, your performance within a clinical setting, even though you're now in non-clinical practice. So we would want to take a look probably at your patient records. So you would probably be required to undergo the in-person assessment. Great question. So we're getting lots of questions here about changes in areas of practice and rules evolving and how that affects the peer and practice assessment process. Really, what you will receive when you get the notice of selection from the college is the pre-questionnaire, which asks you to indicate your role. So just in a very general sense, whether you are engaged in clinical practice, so providing direct patient care, non-clinical practice, as well as mixed practice. And then we will ask for a little bit more detail. So if you're in non-clinical practice, we would ask you to specify you know, whether it's research or administrative function or developing a wellness program or working with a worksite ergonomic assessment. And that would help us tailor specific questions to your practice. So certainly you are only going to be measured and expected to adhere to competencies which are related to your practice. And of course, all of the primary questions and situation-based questions are listed in the membership guide to the PPA, which is currently listed on our website. So that will give you an indication of which competencies we will be focused on during the peer and practice assessment. Okay, well, we have a question here. If you are selected and are not working as a kinesiologist, are you not required to be assessed? So if you are selected and are not working as a kinesiologist, are you still required to be assessed? Well, that presents an interesting question because, of course, you know, registration, in order to maintain a certificate of registration with the college, you are expected to maintain a certain number of currency hours in order to demonstrate currency in your practice. So we would probably want to have a conversation with you about what you're doing. Because, of course, if you are using your knowledge, skills, and judgment that you acquired in your undergrad, in your kinesiology program, then that would be considered still practicing kinesiology. So it's not just about touching patients and direct client care, and that's a little bit of the education that we've been trying to do with the profession to get across the point that the scope of practice is quite wide, and you may in fact be practicing even if you are not doing clinical practice. So certainly we can have a discussion, but really in order to maintain your registration with the college, you should be practicing. And if you're not practicing or considering returning to practice, then we'll need to have a discussion about currency. Okay, so we have a question about how the assessors were selected. So this is a good question. All of our peer assessors they went through a rigorous sort of recruitment process with the college. So they submitted application forms and they were interviewed by college staff, and their application forms and information went through the Quality Assurance Committee, and then they underwent extensive training by the college with communications consultants, and so they have been trained to perform assessments, and they were really recruited from a broad number of areas within the practice, so that we are able to match members up with assessors from similar practice areas, because we of course want this process to be educational and of value and meaningful to you as members. And so we've tried to train and recruit assessors from a broad range of practice areas. So we had a question on what type of financial records should be included and retrieved and brought to the clinical peer and practice assessment. And what we've said is that we're looking for really dates of service on invoices, costs of product or services, the amount collected, the balance of the account, identification invoices of the patients, the provider and title, and to whom the payment is made, as well as identification of service or product provided on the invoice. Now we realize this information may be difficult for members to produce in publicly funded areas. So certainly that's a conversation that you can have with the assessor if and when you are selected. And those in private practice, however, would be expected to produce financial records at the assessment. Okay, So we've got a question here about KIMs who are aides to other healthcare professionals, where the chart is the domain of the other healthcare professional, and the kinesiologist just adds entries based upon his or her assessment or treatment. Well, regardless of whether you're adding notations collectively in as a team, you would be expected in clinical practice to produce copies of those patient records for the assessment in order to demonstrate that you are meeting the standards of practice around record keeping. And certainly if you are having difficulty with your employer around convincing them that this is necessary, or the purview of the college in terms of accessing personal health information, I would encourage you to have your employer contact the college at your earliest convenience. So we have a question here: do the financial records need to match the client chart being assessed? And I guess the short answer to that question is yes, they do. And I should indicate that we're interested in looking at equipment records also. So, the assessor will want you to speak to equipment service records, and when the inspections are occurring, and where the records of equipment inspection, maintenance, and service are kept. So, where the equipment records are maintained by another department, you'll want to know where the records are stored and sort of who's responsible for maintaining them, right? Okay, so it's about 8 o'clock right now, and I noticed that we do have a few questions that have yet to be answered. So what we will do is I will put together an FAQs, and that FAQs will be sent to all participants of this webinar. And what we'll do is we will also post them on the college website, and we'll send you a link to this webinar also if you attended. You've asked some great questions this evening. As I mentioned, the first random selection notices will be sent out this Friday. And I'd suggest that if you haven't already done so, that you review our website, where you can find out more information about the Peer and Practice Assessment. There are a number of resources available online, as I mentioned, the Essential Competencies of Practice, the Practice Standards, Guidelines, and Webinars. Watch the webinars. Any question that you've submitted this evening we'll post as an FAQ. And certainly, if you have any questions, I'm available to speak with you by phone or email. So this is my contact information. And I'd like to thank you again and have a great evening.